today we're going to look at the same thing that we looked at when we talked about the science of reading, a cognitive approach to reading versus a social cultural approach to reading. We're going to look at that that same kind of paradigm when we talk about writing. We know that writing and reading are very closely aligned literacies. The traditional view has been that one is about decoding and one is about encoding, and actually it's much more complex of a relationship than that. And in the last several years, there's been a deep emphasis on looking at writing as a way, as a mode for learning. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, okay? So one of the things I wanted to review real quickly is what is the difference between a cognitive and a social practices approach to looking at literacies. The cognitive approaches looks at cognition, the thinking, the processing. It's very process driven, and it considers skills and discrete skills that that you need in order to be able to complete this complex task. But when you look at social practice, it looks at things like looks at the context, what is the cultural context, what is the political context, what is the economic context. It looks at writing as a mediation of that big D, little d discourse, big D being those like organized ways of thinking and being, and the little d discourses meaning those individual practices of those expectations and the individual experiences with it. And then it considers identity as it relates to writing. What is the relationship between a writer's identity and their writing? So one of the things that we want to talk about is that writing is far more than just encoding. It's language. We mediate our thoughts through language when we're writing, which is probably where we get this idea of it being encoding, and that's certainly true. But the process of writing itself can be a form of learning. We can if learning is changing, we can be changed through the process of writing. And so we want to think about writing as more than just encoding, because if you think of it as just encoding, then there's like very simple structures and very certain rules that can be followed. But the fact of the matter is that there's a lot that has to happen. The writer's constantly taking in a whole number of factors as they are attempting to write. So we want to think about that. So before we get into anything, and this would be true, definitely is true in reading, but for writing, because of the nature of writing, semiotics is a branch of linguistics that we really want to think about, okay? Semiotics also has a lot to do with reading and has a lot to do with like visual interpretation and all of those things. But what is semiotics? What is semiotics? It's a linguistic study of sign systems. So it's a linguistic study of sign systems. And for instance, okay, if I was a reader or a writer and I put DOG, I saw DOG on the page, it's going to bring to mind a dog, right? Even though DOG doesn't look anything like an animal. And so it's a combination of meaning and form. I, as a thinker, can both look at that picture of a dog, think dog, look at the word dog, think dog, and then look at a dog in real life and think dog. And all of those things are a combination of meaning and form. And it's how we're able to look at that form and come to that meaning, okay? So one of the things that we should note, though, is some signs are easier and more direct than others. And part of what makes reading and writing so complex is it's the most difficult type of sign. So the first sign is an icon, which is literally just a diagram or a picture. So an icon of a dog would be a picture of a dog. So it's the most visual and it's the most like literal interpretation of sign and meaning. An index is when you link the object and the sign because it somehow resembles it. So for instance, when I say the word a new set of wheels, wheels is the index for car. I really mean a car, but the sign that the index of wheels allows me to then represent a car. And the last one is completely, so in an index there's some literal relationship between the sign and the meaning. The last one then is symbols, and those are the most abstract. The object is signified through law, rule, or convention. Alphabetic text is definitely the most important symbol system. So you can see why it's a miracle that anybody learns how to read and write, because it is so complex. We need to learn the laws, we need to learn the rules, and we need to learn the conventions to be able to use language, to be able to use written language in a semiotic sense. So one of the things that we want to think about then is that because context is part of what is considered important in semiotics, we need to think about the fact that it's a point of view. And it is, literacy then is looked at as sort of a variety of sign systems in the appropriate contexts. Okay, so we need to think. So I have a picture here of a heart. That would be a totally inappropriate symbol for me to send to, in an email that I'm sending to a student of mine. But if I were to sending it to, say, one of my own children, it would be very, very appropriate. So it's context dependent. That particular, whether it's the actual heart sign or if it's whether or not that I sign an email love, that particular sign is something that is context dependent, and it's not always appropriate for me to use it, and I wouldn't use it in certain situations. Okay, so we can see how semiotics then plays a role in thinking about writing as a social context. But before we go into the social context of writing, we do want to think about what we know about the cognitive processing that goes on in writing. So one of the things that we've established towards the late part of last century was that writing is a unique mode of learning, and that it unfolds through a process. So, prior to this, writing was really only seen as a means to share, to demonstrate your learning. But really, what Janet Emig and colleagues really kind of pushed this idea that we actually learn through the process of writing. And many of you have probably had that experience. Either you've learned in that literally you've done a research on something that you didn't know a lot about, and then you've learned through the process of writing the research, or you've refined your own thinking when you've maybe written an argumentative writing or informative writing. So it's a unique mode of learning, and when we look at the cognitive approach, we want to think about that. And if we think of learning as being changed, then we can be changed by our writing just as much as we can be changed by our reading. So around the same time as Janet and Higgs, Flower and Hayes were the ones that looked at the writing process, and they had students who they did think alouds as they were writing. They were also sharing what they were thinking and why they were doing the things that they were doing. And so Flower and Hayes came up with this idea of writer-based prose versus reader-based prose. And writer-based prose is writing that meaning is still an important degree in the writer's head. So when our young students think about practice writing, they're often practicing it in a way that it's for themselves. So they don't maybe include transitions. They don't maybe include details that you need to be able to thoroughly understand where a story is set, perhaps, or something like that. Very, very common for young writers to produce writer-based prose. Hopefully, as the students become more as a master writing, they move from writer-based prose to reader-based prose, where then they can start to consider the perspective of the reader. What does the reader need to know to fully understand what I'm saying here? So that's really important. So we want to think about, when we are dealing with older students, oftentimes you'll see them sort of, when we're asking them participate in a kind of writing that maybe they're unfamiliar with or they're unprepared for, you're going to see that move back into the reader-based prose, where they're just thinking through for themselves and they don't have any thought about what the audience needs to be able to fully understand the meaning that they intend. And so writer-based prose should not be seen necessarily as a deficit, but a step. And that was very clear in Flower and Hayes's in their research. They really said that you kind of need to move through writer-based prose to get into reader-based prose. And that, as we get more skilled, we sort of probably do the writer-based prose in our head before we actually compose in person. That's like when you're an adult in graduate school, but we all do kind of need to move from, it's a developmental process to move from writer-based prose to reader-based prose, okay? So that means that Writing then is a recursive process. We keep having to go back to it. So writing is goal-oriented. And as teachers, one of our jobs is to give them a goal, right? To write an argumentative paper, or to write a narrative, or to write an informational text, right? To explain something, to argue something, to tell a story. So those are all kind of goals that we give our writers, okay? And writing is this so larger goal. But there's a series of sub goals, and mastery writers, what they do is they kind of reassess their sub goals in relationship to their main goal. So they keep going back, and they keep going and refining their thinking so that they can make sure that they're actually meeting that overall larger goal. So it's a very complex, cognitively complex process. Priorities are also the ones that you've probably seen this, and I like this because it shows it as being back and forth. And one of the interesting things is we know now we can actually follow keystrokes now and have people write, have kids write directly into computer programs, and we can see how this process really isn't, some teachers like to teach the writing processes as it's linear. First I pre-write, and then I write, and then I revise, and then I edit, and well, sometimes, but then I revise. So then I write, maybe I do peer editing, then I revise, then I do the final editing, and then I share it, right? I publish it. Well, that's not really true, and you can see the back and forth and the back and forth in this particular graphic, which is why I picked it, because it really isn't that linear. And when we follow writers in their, when we look at their keystrokes, you can see a writer engaging in the writing process in a very nonlinear way, very clearly using technology today, because maybe that person will jot down a couple of bulleted points at the top of their essay that they want to make sure that they get. And then they write a first paragraph and they see an editing mistake, so they go in and they, maybe it was flagged by Word. They go in and they check that. And then they write the next paragraph, but they see that they don't have any transition. So you see them constantly going back and forth. And we even see now digitally that we can, even when we are published, we can actually go back when we notice something, or when somebody asks us a question that's not clear, we can go back and we can fix it and then reshare it. I know I've done that a lot on like Facebook when I've noticed that I have a grammar error, say, in my post. So the writing process, while it has all of these different steps, it's not a linear piece. So, when I worked with writers, I would often work with, in my high school, you're working with some very skilled writers and some very developing writers. And so I would say things like, let's do pre-writing. And I would have some of the students say, well, I like to kind of write and plan as I go. And I understood that. But one of the things I would say, one of my compromises is, I need to know what you're thinking, and I can't know what you're thinking unless I make you write this down. And so I would try to modify some of my expectations in ways that were kind of more, more respectful of their individual writing processes, but there were some things that I just needed to see, and we talked about that, and we talked about why that is, and we talked, and I acknowledged that for some of them, they didn't need it to be the way that I had sort of planned it to be, and sometimes if I could, I would allow them to make some room to maybe don't give me a full web, maybe give me an outline if that's what you prefer, or however it might look. Okay. So that, even when we're thinking of writing as a cognitive approach, we see that process is very personalized, right? It's not a linear process. But when we start to move into the social cultural perspective in writing, what we start to see that it's an emphasis, much more of an emphasis on the personal nature of writing. When I was a literacy coach, I used to work with teachers, and I used to explain to teachers, you have to be very careful when you're critiquing a student's writing. Let's take math as an example, as a counterexample. If I get an answer wrong in math, it's very, very easy for me to understand why that is. It's math is either right or wrong. It's very objective, and I can see where my thinking was flawed. Writing, on the other hand, unlike the math problem that I just either answered or didn't answer, writing is something that I produce myself. And so I view it as very subjective when you say that it's got problems with it, right? So we have to be very, very careful when we're working with writers and very respectful of the fact that this is the production of their own thinking. And that has to be honored even when we have all kinds of problems with the text that they've produced, right? Um, so really, up until the 70s, we saw writing. It was very formulaic. There was a lot of emphasis on structure, and it was in 1970s. It was in the 20th century, and it was out of the National Council of Teachers of English and a couple of other experts in the field where they started to lead a cry for reform for the way that we teach language arts, specifically for the way that we teach reading and writing. And they use this term, which I thought was really interesting. We need a return of the humanness, the humaneness, the humanism, and the humanity in the classroom, meaning we need to bring the person back into the center. We need to recognize writing as a very personal, social, and cultural experience. So, what this does is it brings writers into the center of the process. I mean, even as you can tell, even in the cognitive approaches that we've adopted in the 21st century, they really do have the writer at the center of the process, as opposed to old school ways of writing where it was really all about the audience, and the audience was really the teacher, right? So, we need to be aware too that formal and regimented demands can often hinder discovery. So, if writing is a way for students to discover their thinking, so we want to be careful that we're not placing too much hindrance on discovery, and that we're not sort of valuing the product over the thinking. So, one year I was a grader for AP English. It was English language arts, or the English language composition exam. And some of my best essays that, it's a timed test, so it's not like the students could, pre-plan everything. You go in there and you have about 50 minutes to write a response to your prompt. Some of the best ones that I had were students who actually shifted their position from where they started to where they ended. And it was just cool because you could see through the writing what they were doing was they were reconsidering the prompt and they were delving into the prompt. And so we were trained, by standards of a formal composition. If you looked at a 1950s teaching manual, it probably would be very problematic because they do make the shift. But what if we think of it as writing being a mode of learning, and that we want to respect the quality of thinking? Well, what AP would tell us is that we have to reward the students for what they've done well. So if they've really shown sophisticated and complex thinking about the prompt, that's where they're going to end up being scored much higher than I think a lot of their teachers would have expected, because I think a lot of the teachers maybe were really sort of valuing the form of the essay over the thinking in the essay. So what happened then, as the shift happened, we started to look at how do we teach writing, and what are the things that we do in the writing classroom that allow us to give these students quality thinking time, where we're kind of freeing them of the hindrances of some of the restrictions and demands. And so you see things like free writing, where students are just whatever thought you have. So don't try to don't edit yourself, don't try to censor yourself as you go. Just put it down on paper. And leaving space for just that free thinking. Another thing is writing seminars, where students are given a chance to look at their drafts in a way that gives them, in writing seminars should not be graded, right? There shouldn't be a grade put onto the draft that they bring to the writing seminar, other than just complete or not complete. And then they go in and they get feedback, and they get a chance to, or writing conferences too, get a chance to go back into their writing. Another thing is that we see like drama and dialogue, and allowing the reader to be freed up of some of the structures so they can get their thoughts and thinking out. All right, so now writing in 2020 and beyond is going to be very different than writing was up until the age of the internet, right? And so we want to think about how, when our students are engaging in composing rather than writing, um, we want to think about how they might be composing using multimedia. And so this is the idea of multiliteracies. And there's this idea that the New London Group in 1996, a group of some of the best thinkers in literacy, linguistics, pedagogy, came together and they came up with this. It was a this kind of manifesto about multiliteracies and what we should do moving forward with all of the changes that we're seeing and what it means to be a writer in the 20th century. So this is right before the 21st century. This is right before the move into the 21st century. And they came up with this idea that I really like called the meta language. And what the meta language is that this idea that we are able to describe meaning in various modes, so that when we access a meta language, we have a meaning. We tend to think that we think in language, but we probably really don't. I don't know if we'll ever have the ability to access that part of our mind, but we mediate our thinking into a language. And so when we're talking about multimodality, what we have is the students might have a meaning that they want to convey, but they bring in the various modes so they can convey that meaning. So maybe they want something to have a certain mood, so they pick a certain picture, and then they put some text with it, and then they have a song behind it. And all of those things are very purposeful. And what they're doing is they're accessing this meta language where they have this meaning that they're trying to convey, and they're using the various modes and how those modes interact with each other in order to convey that meaning. So the pedagogy of multiliteracies, that really comes very, very much out of our understanding of literacy as social practice. And the work of Shirley Bryce Heath in the 1980s really helped us to understand that the way our students use language really is very important, the way they use it outside of the classroom, and it really sets them up for success or failure within the classroom. And so she has in her seminal work called Ways with Words, she has these two quotes that I wanted to share with you. The features of cultural milieu affect the ways in which children learn to use language, and language habits are part of the shared learning. And so what Shirley Bryce Heath did was she studied the cultural practices of three groups of students in one North Carolina school district: the majority, minority, and lower socioeconomic status students of color, the middle working class, mostly white students, and then the more privileged upper middle class and upper class white students. And what she found was that there was language practice in all of those situations. There was language, there was literacy. In the African American culture, it tended to be a lot more oral and call and response when you looked at their churches and things like that. And then you saw that with the middle class and the upper class students, it tended to be a little bit more sort of linear and authoritative, like where the parents were the authority and the children listened to the parents. And what she determined was that the practices that each of the students brought into their early classrooms, some of those practices, usually by the white students, were actually more in line with the expectations of school practice, literacy practices, and the black children were kind of left behind because their practices were not valued in the traditional classroom. And so she worked. What was interesting about Shirley Bryce Heath is she actually worked with this school district for years afterwards and helped to develop a curriculum that was more inclusive, and they had a lot of success. And then, unfortunately, we have No Child Left Behind, and all of a sudden testing and all of that. And so, unfortunately, this little utopian time of our understanding of literacy as social practice and some really significant stories and gains that we're seeing, the standardization of curriculum sort of became more important at that point. Another thing that we want to think about is that we think of ourselves as members of a community. So James Gee is somebody who studies like gamers and people who belong to maybe marginalized groups or countercultural groups. There's a number of people. Moji is another one. She studies girls, particularly girls in detention homes, things like that. And what they found is that all of those groups have literacy practices. It's that they're, kind of very specific. So he said, after all, we never just read or write, rather we always read or write something in some way. And so that's James Gee's way of saying that we really have to think about the fact that our students are coming in with some cultural practices and expectations that may or may not be in line with what we experience or expect as a teacher. It's really interesting too that what you find is when you understand that they bring those practices, you can also use those practices to start to bring them to maybe meet your curricular goals. And so that's when you see things like, hip hop and rap being used in the classroom, or maybe if you have students do an argument with a video instead of in writing, you can see how some of these students, because they're far more visual, their world is far more visual, their personal practices are far more visual. All of a sudden you can see some students just showing some really sophisticated thoughts that you don't see when they're in the written word. And so these are all things that we want to consider. So, okay. So now, what are you going to do with this? What I'm going to ask you to do is there is a response to this short video. There's a response assignment. I want you to go ahead and download that on Leo, and I want you to think about, when you think about what it means to bring a writer into the center of the writing classroom, when you think about how cultural factors maybe play a role in your students' writing, and how being members, developing this idea of membership into communities, the implications that it might have in your classroom. So, all right. So thank you very much, and have a good week.